Good evening. Welcome to our creation seminar. All right, Tuesday night crowd, looking good. Let's get this show started. I'm looking forward to find out where I came from, what monkey. If there's any proof, I'm it. No, we all know. Amen. Dr. Malone's He's going to show us tonight. So let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you for another opportunity to meet and learn about your creation from your word, from the evidence. And Lord, just bless Dr. Malone tonight. Bless everybody that's here and still coming, Lord. And we just desire to grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. And bless those that are watching, Lord. We pray in your name. Amen. All right, Dr. Malone.
So we're going to look for Monkey Man tonight. Monkey Man. We've actually been looking for Monkey Man ever since Charles Darwin proposed his theory in 1859. It's 163 years we've been hunting for this dude. 163 years. And we've found a lot of stuff that folks, paleoanthropologists are folks who look at the past of humanity. Paleoanthropologists are people who look at the bones they find in the ground to figure out where people came from. Now, there's the typical scenario. We've looked around and kind of looked at what looks kind of like humans. And this guy's got ears sort of like us, and eyes sort of similar, and a mouth and a chin and fairly big brain, and so he can walk around on two legs, got two arms, same number of fingers, lots of similarities. So that's the best we could find. Now, lots of Christians just laugh at it and scoff at it and just ignore it, this whole idea of we came from some sort of an ape. Trouble is, these guys over 163 years, they've found 10 or 20,000 pieces and parts and skulls and stuff that seem to be in between people and apes. Some of them are just little fragments, some of them are full skulls, bones, most skeletons. So it's good. It makes a pretty convincing story. So if we do nothing with our children and grandchildren but say, oh, it's ridiculous, and don't give them a reason for what are those bones, what are those fossils they're finding, they're going to go to school and they're going to think, gosh, there's all this evidence and I haven't heard anything that shows why it's wrong. So this is an important topic. And furthermore, it's led directly to where we're at with our education system. And I think the turning point was what was called the trial of the century for the entire period of the 1900s, for a 100-year period. This was the most impactful, influential, important trial that happened in the whole world. Anybody know what it was called? The Scopes monkey trial. Why? Why was it so important? Because it had nothing to do with some legal thing, and it had everything to do with publicity and public opinion. What happened was that America was a very, very strong, profoundly, multiple renewals Christian nation right up into the 1900s. And they were watching as Europe became increasingly atheistic, starting with France and then leading to Germany, and then erosions happening in the Scandinavian countries and England. And they saw it in direct proportion to evolution being accepted as an absolute fact. Therefore, the Bible couldn't be trusted, didn't mean what it said. And the focal point of evolution is always, where did humanity come from? Some sort of a link between apes and people. So they passed a law that you couldn't teach evolution in American schools, and it passed in many, many states, especially southern states. Tennessee passed one. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, it's a group of very anti-Christian liberal lawyers. Their goal has always been to undermine the faith in biblical truth in the Bible. They advertised for some teacher willing to say he had taught evolution so they could bring the case to court and present all this evidence that evolution's true. And John Scopes in Tennessee said he would do that. And the trial lasted for several weeks. And the man defending the Bible and Christianity did a horrible job. And by the way, the whole world was listening. Radios were in everybody's home. Television hadn't been invented. And everybody was listening day after day to this trial between atheism and Christianity. And they just brought all sorts of evidences. Now, the evidence for Ape Man that was used in that trial, there were 4 primary examples. One of them was a skull that was very, very ape-like, and a bone that was obviously a human bone from an upright walking type human person, found in the same general vicinity on the island of Java in the South Pacific in 1891. So here's a very ape-like skull with a very human-like bone. Another that was presented was a tooth that was almost a perfect intermediate between an ape's tooth and a human tooth, and they have a very different, distinct shape. And this one seemed to be right in between. And by the way, that picture was out of the London Times from 1922, where they took a single tooth and they added a skull to it, and they added the body to the skull, and they added a family to the guy, and you had a whole ape man based on one tooth. But there's the picture for everybody to see. And by the way, later excavations showed that this wasn't the tooth of an ape, it was the tooth of a pig, and the pig wasn't even extinct, it was still running around alive down in South America. So it had nothing ultimately, okay? Then there was Piltdown Man. Piltdown Man was found in England in 1912, and again, it was a skull that looked very, very ape-like, but the jaw looked very human-like, and the tooth was intermediate in between of the ape and the jaw. So here you have this transition, all you think you would need to show a transition between the two. Now I'm not gonna spend the time talking about these because every single example used as a link between man and ape that convinced the listening world that this was a fact of science, every one of them has been shown to be an absolute travesty. They're all wrong. But it doesn't matter because they influence the thinking of the day. And the last one was Neanderthal Man, and we're going to end the lecture. I'm going to kind of walk through these ape man things from the oldest supposed ancestor that is very, very ape-like to the most recent supposed ancestor that is very, very human-like. And we're going to look at what they really are. And this was a guy, and they found hundreds skeletons, and mostly in Europe. Started out in the Neander Valley of Germany, but they found them in France, they found them in Spain, they found them in Belgium, and so on. Typically, they've lived in caves, and their skulls are more sloped in their forehead, and they're very big-boned, fairly short people, but they look different than we do. The Piltdown one's really interesting, though, and I'm going to go on because I want to just mention what happened with it. It was the definitive proof that we obviously came from apes for 40 years. That's 2 generations of school children. Anybody in the education system in Europe or America who said they kind of doubt this idea that we came from apes, they were just shown this evidence because it was an obvious intermediate skull with an intermediate jaw and a tooth that was right in between, and everything looked exactly in between an ape and a man. And they were basically laughed at because there's the evidence. And they made all sorts of casts. There were over 300 master's and PhD thesis papers written by scientists who were looking at this skull and this bone and these teeth and casts of it over those 40 years. In 1952, someone outside of the field of paleoanthropology, because you realize if you're in a certain scientific field, you are surrounded by, you are inundated by all sorts of information that leads you to think and just agree with a certain line of thought. And it's obvious that Ape Man is reality, it's a fact of science. And I'll tell you why it's viewed that way in just a moment. But in 1952, someone outside of paleontology was trying to test a new dating method that had just been developed, and he asked for permission to go test these bones. So he tested the jaw, then he tested the skull, and he realized they were totally different. They had to have come from totally different time periods. They weren't even related. The researchers went back and looked closer, and there were file marks on the teeth. Back and forth, obviously metal file marks. So for 40 years, 300 researchers were so blinded by their preconceptions that they couldn't even see file marks on the teeth. It was a hoax. Somebody in England, and many people speculate it was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and there's some other people that lived at that time. He's the one who invented Sherlock Holmes, big in the scientific community. And they had just buried it as a hoax, and it was taken so seriously they never came forward to say, oh, this was just a joke. Isn't that interesting? Every one of them has turned out to be a total ridiculous misinterpretation. Now, okay, I'm just going to leave it at that. Oh, the one thing I want to come back to. You understand, we're going to go back to that first picture. Okay? There are only two possibilities when we look at human beings. Either God, literally, one day here on planet Earth, there were no people. They did not exist. And the next day, probably from 1 second to the next, there was a man, fully formed, fully functional, a total, completely developed human being suddenly is appearing here on the planet. That's what the Bible tells us is reality. But that is ridiculous to the scientific world. They can't even begin to consider that that could be true, because it's absurd in their minds that you could just poof, there's a person. So the only other possibility is that something turned into a person. You understand? There's no third choice. Either people were made as people or something turned into a person. And since we have generation after generation left the truth and reality that we have a God who made us out of the thinking of the school children of generation after generation, and they become the teachers and professors, they're going to find something to support the belief that something turned into a human, and the only thing that looks remotely close is some sort of an ape-like creature. So in the minds of the academic community and the schools and the textbooks and the museums, it is an absolute fact of science. So just because they haven't found the right thing yet doesn't mean it's not true. It's still a fact of science, because the alternative can't be considered. You get it? That's what's going on. It's one faith versus another faith. What we're saying is reality is faith, because we can't go prove it, and we don't have a movie, and we don't have a time machine. But the alternative is even more ridiculous, as you're going to see as we go through this next hour. And it literally can't be true, which means what we can't prove has to be true. Okay, so let's jump ahead. So when did this really take off in America, this overwhelming belief? And by the way, we only turned the corner about 2 or 3 years ago. We have polled Americans at large for 100 years about where they believe they came from. And right up until about the year 2019, over 50% of the people in the country still said they believed God had made human beings. Now, I was kind of surprised. In the last 3 or 4 years, it has shifted to where the majority, and we're talking the 55% versus 45%, if only given those two choices, now believe we came from apes. So in every way possible, including this one, Christians are in the minority in this country. And that's why we're seeing the emboldenment of the people attacking the truth and reality and morality in every area. Because we now are clearly not the majority. Now, there was probably never 50% Christians in this nation. Maybe during the revival there might have been. But we were still ruled by an overall Christian viewpoint and respect and acknowledgement that the Bible is a very special book with contains truth. Now, here's what happened. And this is another key turning point in our country. This became a paradigm. The power of a visual image is stunning. No one had ever seen anything like this. the parade of mankind from this little bent over ape, slowly standing up, becoming bigger, his head becoming bigger, and finally a human being at the other end. It was first written as an illustration for a Time Life book in 1965, and the caption was Early Man. And in the text, way down buried in the text, it said, we've never found all of these transitions or intermediates, but this is what we think happened, and we were illustrating it for you. So it's just made up. It's just an artist made this up. But it's stuck. I mean, how many times have y'all seen something like that? Hundreds, maybe thousands. Because it drives that image that this is reality into children's minds until it becomes reality for them. It was used extensively for the next 40 years. It embedded this idea of this ape to human progression from 1965 all the way up into the middle 2000s. Now you still see it, but you start to see it less. Because, and I'll get back to this, in the paleoanthropology community, people studying the bones of humans and apes, nobody believes this is true. The experts that believe we came from apes, they don't even believe this is true. And I'll show you what the latest charts look like, and they're really pretty interesting. But it drove perception. Now, I did a little experiment myself. I went to our public library, and I looked at the covers of National Geographic for every decade from 1910 all the way up to 2000 and up almost 2020. Okay, this is probably 5 years ago I ended this chart. So then I counted, how many times does Ape Man show up on the cover? And it was kind of interesting. I thought there'd be a few, but from 1920 to 1930, 0. 1930 to 1940, 0. 1940 to 1950, 0. 1950 to 1960, 0. Now, Europe was talking about it, but it wouldn't have sold magazines here in the US because most of America still thought this was pretty ridiculous, this idea that an ape turned into a human being. So they didn't feature it, didn't talk about it. But then in 1960 to 1970, you have 2 magazines with the cover featuring some sort of an ape man in a 10-year period. 1970 to 1980 in National Geographic, 5 times every other year there's a cover featuring Ape Man. 1980 to 1990, 7 covers featured some sort of an Ape Man find. 1990 to 2000, we're up to 12. Over once a year, that's the focus of the magazine. Isn't this interesting? Is it driving the culture or the culture following the media? I don't know. I suspect the media has had an enormous influence on our culture, and this was part of it. 2000 to 2010, we were up to approaching 2 covers a year and accelerating. It's like, no matter what the media is, and I was stunned during COVID. I couldn't believe it had gotten as bad as it was. There is a narrative that's given to the reporters, and anything that doesn't fit the narrative is left out and not allowed, and whatever fits into the narrative, that's what's promoted. It's not news. It's a method of molding the beliefs and the behaviors of a culture, and that's what's going on all around us. Time magazine's the same. Now let me show you some of these covers. Here's National Geographic. 3.3 million year bones discovered. You notice how they found bones. They found little fragments of bones. Notice how they make him look like a little cute kid. His face looks kind of human. There was one on Neanderthals. This was back in 1996 where he was just this brutish beast, grabbing his wife and dragging her across and saying, "Cook me some meat, woman." That was Neanderthal, and that's how he was presented in 96. Here's the first pioneer. A new find shakes the human family tree, okay? Now, National Geographic is a credible source of information for the majority of the population, and this is what's being promoted as reality. Love this one, Almost Human, okay? And you'll notice this ape has been given white eyes. Apes don't have white eyes, they're brown. So they've substituted white eyes to make him look really, really human. It's all artistry. Okay, none of that shows up in fossils. And then here is the rise of mammals, the mother of us all, and it's got a little apish baby that she's holding here. Okay, and then there's Time magazine. Another came out every week instead of every month. Here is How Man Evolved, Amazing New Discoveries, The Secret of Our Past. How man became man, and here's where we started. You know, how man began. Fossil bones of the dawn of humanity rewrite evolution. He's not very happy, is he, to become a human? And then here's this guy. He's not very happy either. How apes became humans. Oh, look at the contrast. How we became human. Chimps and humans are 99% identical in their DNA. We'll come back to that one. And then last, Leonardo da Vinci, Sistine Chapel. Not touching the hand of a man, God's reaching down and creating an ape. So it's everywhere. Now, I don't expect anybody to remember any of this, but I want to put this parade of man in a context, because next we're going to start looking at these bones. Because I want you to understand what they are, and I want you to understand how the deception is propagated. Basically, these really hunched over apish creatures, they're called Australopithecines. And these are the earliest links between chimp kind of creatures or ape kind of creatures and mankind. They always have really small brains, they always have really long arms and so on. A couple of them have been seen by just tens or hundreds of millions of people. And I'm going to show you a museum, a traveling science museum exhibit of Lucy that was in Houston, Texas about 15 years ago when I happened to be down there. And the latest one that was all over PBS, public radio, public television, all over the museums and the textbooks about 10 years ago was one called Artie. But they're all this kind of creature. They're very close to being ape-like, but I'll tell you the reasons why they're considered mankind's ancestors. So that's the first link. The second link is called Homo habilis, and we're not even going to look at any examples of that because none of them are complete. Anytime these guys find a bone and they don't know where it goes, they just throw it in a catch-all category that they think is in between Australopithecine and the next one, which is called Homo erectus. And they've never found any sort of complete skeleton. It's just sort of a collection spot for a bunch of bones. And it's a little bit more evolved, supposedly. But the one that is then a direct ancestor to man, and we found lots of these skulls, okay? The human brain ranges from about 1,500 cc's on average up to about 1,700 cc's. These guys have skulls that are down in the 600 to 800 cc range. So they're about half the size of a human brain. They're much smaller. They're usually bent over. They usually have eyebrow ridges. But there's all sorts of evidence that they're really, really intelligent. And I'll show you that evidence. And we found hundreds of them. They exist. What are they? But the Java Man, that skull and that bone that was clearly a human leg bone was thrown into that. There's a little one that was found on an island over in Flores, over in the South Pacific. Fully grown human, he only stood 4 foot tall, but he was very, very human in his characteristics with a very small brain. So those are Homo erectus. Homo being like a humanity, erectus being he stood upright. So upright standing man with a small brain that looked kind of apish. Next you find Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, kind of much more people-like things. And then finally you find modern man, Homo sapiens. So that's where these things fall, and those are the kind of things we're looking at. What are they? That's what we're here to look at. Now, as I said, that's what's been taught for 150 years, and most school children still think, oh, that's the progression. Here's what the experts have decided is mankind's family tree back to apes. It looks like that. They can't agree on anything. Because every time they find something, it contradicts what they found before. And there's all these dead ends and all these false starts. I mean, you've got Neanderthals way up here, and you've got Homo erectus here, and you've got Australopithecines down here, and you got bits and pieces and fragments, and you see none of these things connect. It's not a tree. They just find things that are sort of apish and things that are sort of in between and other things in between, and they can't figure out how any of them fit together. That's where the search actually stands. But they don't. This is a illustration out of Scientific America, 2012. Okay, and it hasn't gotten any better since. So the whole field is in disarray. It's still a fact in the minds of these people because the alternative is people just appeared on Earth. But there's all these disconnects. There's all these huge missing links. But what are these skulls that they're showing here that are in between man and ape? That's what we're getting to. Now, let's start with Lucy. These creatures called Australopithecines, they've been found mostly in Africa, but they've also found some in Lower Asia. They found some in Australia that look very similar. Are these the earliest human beings? Well, the first one was found in 1974 by Donald Johansen. He had a team over in Ethiopia, in Africa. And for the next, probably 40 years, it was promoted to every school child and every textbook as the definitive proof that some sort of an ape has turned into a human being. Why? Well, first of all, it's assumed to have had human hands, human feet, a human-like hip, and a human-like spine and posture. But it stood about this tall, okay? So it was very ape-like in size and brain size. I went to this exhibit in Houston, Texas. By the way, I didn't even know it existed. I was down there on a business trip for Dow Chemical. That poster is probably, that banner, it's probably 20 feet wide and 40 feet tall. And they were hanging from the skyscrapers all over town in Houston, Texas as you were driving through town. Just probably dozens of them all over. And I knew what I was going to find, and I didn't even want to go, but I thought I really ought to go. And it was kind of interesting because the first thing I noticed as I pulled into the parking lot was this sign: Teachers Reporting Point, students form a single file. It's there to program the students what to believe about where they came from. And here comes the students. They stood there and billions of years and all this stuff about evolution. And there's no proof. There's just fully formed animals that are very distinct in shape, but you can line them up just like you can line up a tricycle, and I can line up a bicycle and a motorcycle and a car. And I could say, see, this proves the tricycle turned into the car. That's what they do with the fossils. They just line them up. You can make a sequence of anything. But there's huge differences between very different body structures, and those are just ignored for the most part. But they had a special room upstairs, and it's like a shrine. It was all darkened, and there was like velvet carpet, and there was like, it's almost like a cathedral. There were tapestries on the walls, and your eyes were immediately led to the sign that said, this whole display is about beginnings and beliefs, with a picture of Lucy there right beside it, supposedly, okay? Where you came from. And if you looked at the text, and I just going to underline a couple things, they're emphasizing what is our origin, what is our purpose. It's all about, they're linking where we came from with what we should know about what our purpose is in life. This isn't science, this is all about philosophy. This is all about training people to think in a certain way, starting with children. It says science contributes to this discussion of what is our purpose. Not really. It says the fossil record links us to our past, going back millions of years and so on. It's exceptionally rich in hominoid. Now, they use this fancy words. Hominoid just means a fossil of something that is not quite human. So it's becoming a human, a hominoid fossil. There's a long line of early human ancestors living in this region of Africa where Lucy was found, and the developing traits that made us who we are. So scientists from Ethiopia found Lucy. Oops. And then on the back, I just want to emphasize, when they get down through all this verbiage, they say, what you're really here is to see the reason for being here. By looking at the fact you came from an ape, you can now make conclusions about why you exist. Well, if we came from an ape, who makes the rules? We make the rules. You know, it's just everything's relative. So then they show the bones and so on. But the thing I noticed right away, they couldn't quite bring themselves to totally lie. This is the only bones they found in the skull. A little piece of the jaw, a little piece of the back jaw, and 2 little pieces of the skull. That's it. Everything else is pretend. Everything else was made up. They had never found any hands or any feet with that skull. Only 20% of the bones were found after years of searching. They found fully human bones in the same vicinity. The original report by Johansen, he found totally human-sized bones in the same general area and rock layers as he found this little chimp. Well, if you found the two together, why would you say the chimp came from the bones? Because they were found in the same rock layer right there together. He later, based on advice from friends that this was nothing significant unless you could explain those human bones, he said, the little bones are from a female, the bigger bones are from the male, and he's down on the ground running around like a normal human being, so he needed bigger bones. And he just said those bones are human. But originally he said they are human bones, so he changed his story. Subsequently, and we're talking 30 years later, they found full skeletons of this little chimp, and they didn't have human-like feet, they had ape-like feet. Now here's the difference. Here's a human foot, and here's various ape and chimp feet. Does anybody see the difference? They're not even remotely similar. Apes have to have feet like this because they hang around in trees, and they use it to grip the trees. I'll come back to this footprint later, okay? It's called the Lakatui footprint. But our feet make footprints that look just like this. You would see a distinct toe off the edge if that had been made by an ape. So here's the actual facts. Fully human footprints and evidence that these people making those footprints used tools. They were very intelligent human beings. They were found in another country about 1,000 miles away, but it was exactly the same rock layer, okay? So Johansen finds these bones, Lucy, in a rock layer in Ethiopia. About 20 or 30 years later, I forget what the date is, they find a trail of footprints that are clearly human footprints and tools in that same rock layer, but it's 1,000 miles away. So Johansen and all of the museums immediately start putting human feet on the displays of Lucy, because they hadn't found another. So here they are. They found these footprints. I mean, does anybody have any doubt that those are human footprints? They're clearly right, left, stepping human footprints. Same thing here. So here you have Lucy. Suddenly she grows human hands and human feet. I mean, that's what we later found out Australopithecines' feet looked like. This is what you see. No, here they are. You laugh, but there is a museum display, and it's in, I believe it's the Chicago National History Museum. Look at her feet. They stuck human feet on that ape in order to convince people that it's an upright walking ape-like creature. Now here's the actual facts. Lucy had a hip that's completely unlike humans, and it's very, very ape-like, okay? Everyone they found, it's been in. Now they're shaped different because an ape is bent way over. It needs to be bent to hang and be very mobile in trees. Now they can walk upright, but they don't do it in a human way. Their hips are shaped very different. Lucy's hip is shaped like an ape. The critical piece, the ape piece that was found, was crushed into 40 pieces. Now you can imagine, you take a bone crushed into 40 pieces, guess how many ways there are to rearrange them? You can rearrange them any way you want, typically. But some of them were fused and they couldn't get them to be rearranged the way they wanted, and it was obviously ape-like. And even expert paleoanthropologists who accept apes turned into humans, they disagree that Lucy walked upright. But in a museum display in Houston and everywhere else, the kids aren't told that. They're just told this creature walked upright in a human-like manner, and they look at it and it has human feet. See the deception? But in the minds of researchers, well, we might not have it quite right, but it's got to be a fact, so it's close to being right. Good enough. I'm going to back up. I'm going to show you a little film, and I just broke out laughing when I saw what happened here. This is a Nova special. It's a public television broadcast, and the guy who was an expert on Lucy realized that the hip looked like an ape's hip, but he thought it had to have walked upright. It had to have been an upright walking creature. So watch what he does. Listen to his words as he describes it's an ape-like hip, and watch what he does to convince himself and others, oh, it must have been an upright walking creature. Okay, listen to this.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea.
See, there's the 20% of the bones.
We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't.
Because it looked like an ape's hip.
Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossilization.
Not sure what happened to the sound. Huh. Hang on.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, fit together so well that they are in an anatomically impossible position. This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
He said an animal stepped on it and
The
fused
perfect
them
fit
together
was an
so they're in the
illusion
wrong
that made
position.
Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost. Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died.
How does he know what they were
It was a
before she
tricky
died?
job, like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Isn't that stunning? It looks like a chimp's hip, but it must be human, so I'll grind it to look like a human hip, and now it all works. And that's a Nova special. It's stunning, the blindness that goes on. So what was Lucy? Well, she had a body of an ape. It's only 4.5 foot tall, and her arms are hanging all the way down past her knees. She has the brain, the face, the jaw of an ape. The brain's smaller than a chimpanzee, and the jaw's clearly ape-like. She has the spine of an ape. Our spine is very, very distinct with this lower back S curve. That isn't found in apes. And she is the vertebrae that were found had no curved lumbar region. The shoulders and the rib cage are characteristic of an ape, not a human. The feet and the hands are those of an ape, not a human, when subsequent ones were found. And the pelvis was fragmentary and disputed, with little evidence indicating that it was anything but an ape-like pelvis. Simply a variation of an ape, a little bigger than a normal chimpanzee, a little smaller than a normal ape. So there are variations in apes, there's variations in humans. And that's like the best evidence they've had for 40 years. But students aren't shown any of this stuff. The next biggie that just like, oh, forget Lucy, we found a better Ape Man evidence was Artie, found in the early 2000s. And he was like the ruling prince of Ape Man fossils for the next 10 years. Found in Ethiopia this time in 1992. It took them 17 years to come out with the report after they found him. Why? They found it? Why would it take them 17 years? Well, because the pieces were scattered over 4 miles. Now, what animal dies and they find the pieces of the same animal over 4 miles? Not very many. So they're combining pieces from who knows what. And they describe some of the bones as being like mush. They were so degenerated and degraded. You can imagine how much imagination went into putting them together. Well, doesn't stop science news. Here's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa. The whole book is about Artie, okay? Now, what was he? Here's another illustration. Bigger than Lucy, all right? So now we got something that's bigger. Look at the bones that were found. He's got these really long ape-like fingers. He's got ape-like feet this time. See the toes sticking way out to the side? And he got a few teeth and a few pieces of the skull. Well, his skull was very, very ape-like. His brain was about the same size of an ape. His hips were almost identical to an ape. His spine didn't have the curve of a human. His teeth were more like an ape than a human. His hands, his arm, and his feet, nobody disputes are ape's hands. He's assumed to be a link to man because he was assumed to have walked upright and had a slightly larger brain. That's it. That's what put him as a fact of science that this is our ancestor. Now, here's the disagreement among the paleoanthropologists. They found 100 pieces of its skull, and some of them were more like mush. And then they scanned them in, used a computer to digitally put them together in a three-dimensional computer program. And after thousands of hours and 11 different attempts, they finally figured out how to get that skull put together so the skull looked more human-like on a computer screen. That was it. That's the evidence. Isn't it stunning? And here's a quote by another paleoanthropologist. Now, this is a really well-known guy, works at the University of Southern California. He put his comments in the Anthropology Review magazine. He says of Artie, the pelvic remains so severely crushed that as many as 14 reconstructions, I talked about 11 reconstructions of the skull, 14 reconstructions by computer program imaging was considered to decide which one was most in line with the data. A substantial degree of speculation went into the reconstruction. Subtle changes would have yielded a far more ape-like anatomy. So there's all this disagreement even amongst the experts. You understand? Stuff that's supposedly presented as definitive is not. Science magazine didn't mention any of that. He was simply an extinct ape with a lot of ape features. Now, I'm going to jump ahead because here's the question. These things are all super speculative. They're all controversial. None of them. Those are those little teeny bars on that graph I showed you that don't lead to anywhere. But what are these other skulls? Homo erectus, things that don't seem quite human. Hundreds of them have been found, and they've been given various names, and you've probably heard some of these. Peking Man, Java Man, the Hobbit, and Natolidi, and many others. They're all smaller than modern humans. This one that was called the Hobbit was only 3 foot 6 inches tall. Their brains are all smaller. Some of them clear down to 420 cubic centimeters versus ours are 1,600. They all have sloping foreheads. They all have big eyebrow ridges. And they've been found all over the place. Africa, China, South Pacific, Australia, Europe. Okay? So they're there. Now here's the thing. And here's the reconstructions of them. These are all various artists' drawings of what they think this guy looked like. So they're just their imagination. Java Man was a skull cap, a tooth, and a femur found in 1892. That's that picture I showed early on. Here's various reconstructions of what they think he looked like. Now, here's the thing. Their hands are identical to human hands. Their feet are identical to human feet. Their bone proportions are identical to human beings. They don't have arms hanging way down below their knees. Their skull shape is mostly the shape of our human brain skull. Okay, so they're not very ape-like. And their pelvis is obviously human. They obviously walked in a very upright manner. That's what they've found. They often find tools with these guys. Hammers, chisels, various things that they have used to prepare food and kill animals. They've found evidence of, they produce intricate art and they take care of their old and their weak. These don't sound like apes, do they? But they're very different from us. What are they? See, we really need to have an answer. What are they? They aren't being made up, okay? And here's another example. They found the Hobbit guy over on this little island of Flores. Now, there's a 10-mile gap to get from the various islands. 13 miles here, 10 miles there. And, you know, there's hundreds of, or maybe 1,000 miles of ocean other places. So there's this really strong current sweeping day and night with every tide between this gap. So they couldn't have swum to get there. If they try to swim that, they're going to get swept out to sea. So the researchers, the only conclusion they can come to is that these guys built a boat and sailed in order to get to where they lived. And it's a logical conclusion. And here's one of the comments in Discover magazine. What type of brain does it take to build a boat, steer it, cross 15 miles of choppy sea and strong currents? Could a chimpanzee do it? Not likely. Such a voyage requires modern skills, planning, working as a group, and talking. So those are the kind of things that they're coming to conclusions about that we've got to figure out what's going on here. And this is just a repeat of what I've already said. Significant evidence of intelligence, what are the remains? Now, I didn't know. I'm going to end this session with about a 5-minute summary by a man named Dr. John Sanford. He's one of the world's top geneticists, worked his whole career at Cornell University. He and another young man who's getting his PhD in geology, they spent about 10 years studying all the literature about what all these experts are saying. But remember, his expertise is genetics, and he understands how things change over time. And they looked through all these different bones, including these ones, and I think they came to the best explanation I've heard for where did these little people with human-type brains come from, but except smaller. Well, here's a couple clues. Man has been degenerating since Adam. Ever since Adam in the fall, and we rebelled against God, God started a deterioration and death upon all of creation, including humanity. And every generation's a little worse than the generation before. Our lifetimes have dropped off, and the number of genetic diseases have built up in all of humanity. But there's a couple factors that greatly accelerate the degeneration of any group of people. One is inbreeding. When you get a small population of people, like 2 people end up going to an island, and they're the only ones there, and they have children, those children end up intermarrying. And then their children end up intermarrying. And then the 4th generation end up intermarrying. And all these mistakes start building up and doing really bad things to the human body and the physique. You get all sorts of diseases, short lifetimes, and actual physical distortion of the human look. Second, malnutrition causes physical changes in human beings, as does disease. But also living on a starvation diet, generation after generation, has a known biological result that I'll show you in a second. You see, if you insulate a species of anything, whether it's an elephant or a human being, and they have to compete for a limited amount of resources, a smaller body is always favored because they need less calories to survive. So they have an advantage if they're smaller. It's known as Insular Dwarfism. And here's an example. Off the mainland of Africa, mainland elephants look like this, but over on an island where there's not very many resources, they can genetically show these 2 came from the same original elephant. The elephants look like that. Over a period of hundreds of years, the smaller elephants had an advantage. So eventually, a whole new group of elephants developed with much smaller heads, much smaller bodies. And it's a known fact of biological science. So what are these things? That island of Flores, and this isn't even a creationist, this is out of Nature magazine. The discoverer of the small bones of humans on the island of Flores admits the size of the fossil is best explained by insular dwarfism. People went there, they lived there for hundreds of years, they interbred, and the smaller ones survived better. And eventually you ended up with a group of people who had very small bodies. if early humanoid populations survived long-term on these islands, they would have been subject to getting smaller and smaller, like what we found. Second, our brain takes up 2% of our body mass. It uses 20% of the calories and oxygen that our body takes in. So if you're struggling to survive, the smaller your brain is, the better you're going to be able to survive over long periods of time and many, many generations. So there's a natural biological tendency for bodies to get smaller and brains to get smaller when you inbreed and when you live in an isolated area with limited resources. So that's what these things are. They're a degeneration of humanity. They're not apes growing more and more intelligent in the process of becoming a human being. All of these little brain fossils they're finding are human beings that were isolated in a very tough period of human history, the Ice Age following the flood. They're isolated from other groups of humans. They're interbreeding. They're struggling for resources. And over a period of decades and centuries, you end up with these small, apish kind of human beings. They're a variation of fully functioning human beings. So that's what they are. And by the way, this is what an artist figures out this little guy that was living on this island of Flores actually looked like. It's not an ape. It's a little human being. It looked nothing like that. That's the original illustration when they first found it. Okay, now we're going to go to Neanderthal. So basically, they've got nothing. We have a better explanation for what those bones are, and the earlier ones are clearly ape-like. So this missing link between man and ape is broader and wider than it ever was. But you wouldn't know it to talk to any young person, because they're only spoon-fed information that agrees with the reality that folks that eliminate God from their thinking need to talk about. So here's Neanderthal. He was first found by a man named Boyle way back in the 1800s, after Darwin, like 1876, I think the first one was found. And this was his original drawing of what it looked like. Now keep that in mind, okay? This image was shown in museums and textbooks for the next 100 years, pretty much. I'll show you some other drawings. Here's an image out of the Chicago's Field Museum. Pretty apish looking creatures. Here's another set of casts. This was Ape Man right here. Here's human. He looks more apish, and then they throw an ape in there for comparison. This is out of the Getty Field Museum. That display was probably there for 50 years. Here's an 1888 reconstruction of Neanderthal. This drawing, a friend of mine, Dr. Jerry Bergman, he was over in Germany just 5 years ago, and he happened to be in a airport gift shop, and they had posters of Neanderthal skulls because they found the original Neanderthals in Germany. Now here's the original drawing. So he purchased this drawing, and you notice how the jaw is way out here. He's like, his whole jaw is stuck way out, like an ape's jaw is stuck way out. Okay? Well, guess what? In the drawing, they took the jaw and they shoved it forward well over an inch. I mean, this notch fits into there in a human being, and that's where that jaw actually belongs. See, this is what it actually should have looked like. They've just distorted it for no reason other than propaganda to convince people that these Neanderthals looked like that. Now, when they actually took the bones of Neanderthals, and we found hundreds of them, and we now, I mean, we're really good at this with computers and police and CSI programs. We can take bones and we can add muscles to the bones. And that's what they've done. They've taken those bones and added the muscles, and then they'll take the muscles and add the skin. This is what they actually think Neanderthal looked like. It doesn't look like an ape at all. It's just a human being. That's all these guys are. These guys lived right after the flood during the Ice Age, and Europe was just covered with snow during the Ice Age. So they were up there living amongst glaciers, living in caves, which would be a great place to live during an Ice Age, and struggling to survive in a really tough period of Earth history. And they looked just like all ethnic groups, somewhat different than other ethnic groups. Here's another picture of what they think they look like. So there's the original, and there's what we now know Neanderthals looked like. They're just human beings. Nothing to do with a link with apes. So, matter of fact, their brains are bigger than our brains on average. They were just constructed all along. And we now know they used jewelry, they made musical instruments, they did cave paintings, they were capable of speech, they hunted mastodons and incredibly large animals as a group. They were really, really smart people, just a little shorter than us. And that's what we now think they look like. So they're 100% human. By the way, and National Geographic has now come to recognize that. They still needed to give him this really rather ratty hairdo and not a very nice expression, but other than having a bad attitude, he's fully human, and we know it. And by the way, we have sequenced European genes, and we've sequenced the genes that are left in those bones, and most Europeans have somewhere in the 2 to 4% Neanderthal in their DNA sequence. And here's a Russian boxer who's now, or was a member of the Russian parliament. He must have some Neanderthal genes, but he's fully human. Just happens to have a sloped skull. Last subject. Man, this has been promoted like that icon, that parade of humanity. People have heard this hundreds, if not thousands of times, that chimpanzee DNA is, and I just showed you, one of those Time magazines said apes are 99% identical to humans. This one said 98, I've heard 97. Well, here's kind of the thing I'd never thought of. That statement started to be parroted and talked about in the late 1970s, and no one had decoded DNA in the 1970s. They just looked at one tiny little sentence out of the 3 billion letter novel that our DNA is. And they saw a lot of similarities between apes and humans. And there's going to be a lot of similarities because God designed the two with similar bodies. That represents the DNA of an ape. The only difference between that amount of DNA and a human DNA would be about that much, a little 2% difference. Well, obviously, people are going to say, they must be related. They're so similar. They've got to be related. That's the whole point of saying that over and over again. It took 10 years, dozens of labs all over the world, probably $1 billion, to totally decode the DNA sequence of apes and then the DNA sequence of humans. We now have been able to do it really fast and really cheap, but originally it took a long time. So we could, letter by letter, compare the sequence of an ape and the sequence of a human for the first time in about 2012. I think that's when it was finally completed. And when we did that, we discovered there's not a 2% difference, there's not a 3% difference, there's not a 10% difference, there's between 20 and 30% difference. That would be 20%, that would be 30%. It's all been a lie. And you don't, by the way, you don't see it being parroted and talked about anymore. You know, a 20% difference is 600 million differences between us and an ape. Think about that. Our DNA is like a computer program or an incredible stack of books. And out of the whole stack, there's 600 million of the letters that are different. And we don't have a clue what they all do yet. It's so obvious that we're completely different. Now, I'm going to end with Dr. John Sanford, and I'll often end a whole week-long seminar with him, because this man was an atheist almost his whole life. He taught genetics at Cornell. He's world-renowned because he invented what's called the gene gun. It's the process of, he was a plant geneticist, of taking the DNA information out of the nucleus of a plant cell and then transplanting and splicing that information into the nucleus of another plant cell so you can do faster breeding of plants and hopefully have better characteristics. That's very controversial to doing this because we don't necessarily know what the end result's always going to be, but it has resulted in a lot of really great crop improvements and ability to feed a lot more people. But as he studied what's happening with genetics. He realized he couldn't find a single example of a mutation which added useful information to anything ever in all of history and all of genetics. There's not one example of a random change making a book better. That's what has to happen. Now, you can remove information and it can have a useful purpose sometimes, and that's what students are shown. But to add increased levels of complexity and information never happens by random changes. And he realized everything's deteriorating downward. And he compares it with like a piece of rust on your automobile. You don't see it. When a molecule of iron rusts, you don't see it. But then another molecule rusts, and another spot rusts, and another spot rusts. And it's not making your automobile better. It's not making it shinier. It's not adding new features to your automobile. It's destroying stuff. And if you just let that process go, eventually the whole thing's just going to rust out and fall apart. And that's what's happening to every single human being walking around on the planet. Every generation's a little worse. Every time our cells divide, our skin cell divides, there's mistakes in the next skin cell that weren't there before. Every time a muscle cell divides, there's mistakes that weren't there before. And God built all sorts of mechanisms in our body to correct these, but after about 50 years, those mechanisms don't start working as well, and the mistakes start winning out. And our muscles start to deteriorate, and our skin starts to sag, and our hair starts to turn gray, and our brains don't work as well. And guess what? I'm there. And we're all going to be there. He said we die because we mutate to death, and there's no stopping it. It's what God built into creation as the curse for our rebellion. So he's going to talk about the evidence to wrap this whole thing up for how clear it is that these evolutionary processes couldn't have transformed an ape to a man. And I'm going to roll that, and we'll just wrap it up after that. Let's see. Let's go with that. Okay, here we go.
4 powerful arguments that actually disprove evolution have come to light in the last decade.
Why isn't it
And that's
showing?
like, these arguments are incredibly strong. First one is programming of life. So I'd like to read a quote here
hang on a
from
second.
Bill Gates, who knows a little bit about computers, right? And so he says this: the understanding of life is a great subject. Biological information is the most important information we can discover because over the next several decades it will
I'm going to start
revolutionize
this over as soon as I
medicine.
figure out how to get it
Human
over your
DNA is
screen.
like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. And in other words, the information.
Okay, just a second. I don't know what's going on. In this. Okay, love computers, don't we? Okay, anybody know why I'm not projecting to my projector? Want to give me a hand up here? That would be great, because I really want to show this. It's well worth watching. See, everything I do isn't source not found. I don't know. I may have to do something over here. Okay. There it is. Okay. Maybe. Just a second. Huh. This is a real bummer. It's still not showing. And now. There it is. Okay, now I'm getting closer. can't get to it. It says it can't get to it. Wow. All right, I'm going to try one last thing, and we may have to punt. You know, I tried this on the projector right before the meeting, and it worked just fine. I can't even get my computer to do anything at the moment. It's like it's locked up. All right, I'm sorry. If I get a chance and I have time, I'm going to show it tomorrow because it's really, really profound. But we're just going to have to wrap up. Bottom line being, it's been publicity and misconceptions and leaving out the truth that's driving this whole thing. And the evidence isn't there. It's misinterpreted when it is there. So I hope this helped, kind of gave you, you know, there are things out there, but there's other explanations that explain why they're there. And it has nothing to do with apes turning into humans, as you all knew coming in. But it just kind of gives you some conversation pieces, and I hope it was helpful. And we'll just wrap it up right there. Yes? Oh, for sure. Lucy, for instance. Right. 40 years, and that does happen. That does happen. But usually, there's a circling of the wagons of a scientific community in a given discipline. And if there's nothing better, they'll just keep promoting the best they've got. Because remember, everybody knows the only alternative is God did it. And honestly, that isn't scientific, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's scientific. Is it true? That's what matters. And there's really good genetic reasons why you could never take a book and randomly change the letters and slowly transform that book into a different book with different information and different features and different abilities. And that's what you have to do to change an ape into a human. So there's all sorts of reasons to know that could never happen, but the alternative isn't allowed to be considered. So it's just, you wait till you find something that seems to be a little better than what you already had, and then you just promote it really strongly. And when it turns out to be a problem, you find something else. Yeah. We found I've got a picture of a little over 9 foot tall Chinese guy with a 3.5 foot tall Chinese guy. So even today we have huge people, but it's usually a thyroid problem and a growth issue, and it's not really a genetic characteristic, but it still shows that people can grow very, very big, you know, in the past there was probably even more variety. In the fossil record, we see way more variety of very large creatures than are alive today. So yeah, giants existed. The Bible talks about giants before and after the flood. I think the ones before the flood were something special, and Genesis talks about that. There was a demonic thing that was going on, and part of the judgment of the flood. Okay, any other questions? And I hate leaving a lecture when it just kind of flopped at the end. It's just, but these things happen. So anyway, thanks. Yeah. Right. I think that's, you got to find enough of the bones to know. But like skulls have growth plates, and when a child's are mobile, and once they fuse, they're pretty much fully grown humans. And there's other indicators in the bones and the way the bones are formed, and teeth characteristics change from adults to children. So I think it's probably fairly valid that they're finding adults that are fully grown that are that size. There's enough other indicators that support that. Yes. Yes. No. They start programming kids to think in terms of everywhere, all through the universe, chemicals are coming together and forming different forms of life. Okay, and definitely here on Earth, and they'll show them an experiment called Miller's experiment from 1952, where they took ammonia and methane and they had sparks, and they formed some of these little chemicals called amino acids. Now, and they'll imply, because, see, an accident can form some of these little chemicals, and these chemicals are used by life, so therefore life could form. But the students aren't see, tomorrow night you're going to see the presentation I give when I go into high schools. And it's not complex. And I just let kids know that every experiment ever done, billions of dollars, hundreds of years, we've tried to make chemicals come alive, and every single experiment has the same result. Chemicals never come alive. And that's using all of our intelligence and cheating by using these very complex biological chemicals that are only made inside of life. And random energy could never make these chemicals to begin with. And yet they still don't come alive. So we know the truth. You just have to tell the students that. And all of a sudden they realize, wow, that experiment from 70 years ago that's still in the textbooks is the best they have. It's obviously doesn't even come close to showing how life could form. Yeah, so, yep, good question. All right, thank you. Oh, let me talk about the books, because I'm only here tonight and tomorrow night. Tomorrow night, I'm leaving at 7 a.m. from Spokane on Thursday morning, so I'll be driving up to Spokane as soon as we're packed up. And I'd rather not take any more books than I have to, so buy some books. Give them to people. And again, these are absolutely gorgeous witnessing tools. The latest one, that wasn't even here last time, actually two of them I don't think were, it's called Without Excuse, The Compelling Evidence for Creation. At least twice a month, there's this little QR code you can put your phone at, and you can see these little 2- and 3-minute videos. It's got lots in here about how people can become blind to the truth and why evolution's being accepted, and lots of really cool things about animals and creatures. And just look through them. Every page is just gorgeously illustrated. This is a full color book I don't think I had last time. And then I think most of you have this Have You Considered book, but they're all similar. The devotionals, they're all devotionals. And the fun thing is, nobody could resist reading what is on their birthday. So when I give them to people, I say, just read the day that's on your birthday. It's got this cool, interesting story about something in nature and God that God has done. And even if there's this aversion to God, they still kind of want to see what's on their birthday. So it's kind of this neat tool. The videos that I mentioned before are just a phenomenal way to share with children and grandchildren and pass on to other churches. Make sure you sign up for the newsletter list. And the stuff's all out there. 10 items for $70 or 3 for $25. So thank you. Okay.
I have a praise. You guys want to hear some good news? Today, the Supreme Court.
Oh.
Do you know about this?
No.
Supreme Court rules religious schools can access taxpayer dollars.
Cool. Yeah, I thought you were gonna say they threw out abortion.
We're praying on that one. That's next.
Okay.
Roe versus
Very
Wade.
cool.
Are you guys praying?
Yeah.
So I thought I wanted to share that because that
Yeah.